The rain hammered against the cracked windows of Murphy's diner like angry fists demanding entry. Inside, the fluorescent lights flickered with the persistence of a dying heartbeat, casting uneven shadows across the worn linoleum floor that had seen better days decades ago. The smell of burnt coffee and old grease hung heavy in the air, mixing with the faint scent of desperation that seemed to cling to everything in this forgotten corner of downtown. Sarah Martinez wiped her hands on her stained apron for the 100th time that evening, her fingers trembling slightly as she glanced at the clock above the kitchen pass. 9:47. Just over an hour left in her shift, and then she could go home. Home to her cramped studio apartment where the heating barely worked, and the neighbors upstairs seemed to practice interpretive dance at all hours. But it was her sanctuary, the one place where she could lock the door and pretend, for a few precious hours, that the world wasn't slowly crushing her spirit one disappointment at a time. She had been working at Murphy's Diner for 3 years now, ever since she dropped out of college when her mother got sick. The medical bills had piled up like autumn leaves, and someone had to keep food on the table and a roof over their heads. Her dreams of becoming a teacher seemed like stories from another lifetime, filed away in the same mental drawer where she kept her other impossible wishes. The diner's clientele was a rotating cast of night shift workers, insomniacs, and people who had nowhere else to go. Most were harmless enough, lost in their own struggles and grateful for a hot meal and a warm place to sit. But, lately, there had been trouble brewing in the form of 3 men who had made Murphy's their regular hangout spot. Tommy Ricci, Danny Walsh, and Steve Morrison called themselves businessmen, but Sarah knew better. She had grown up in neighborhoods where guys like these operated, running small-time cons and intimidation schemes, always looking for their next easy mark. They had started coming in about 2 months ago, initially just ordering coffee and pie, making crude jokes among themselves. But, as the weeks passed, their attention had increasingly focused on her. It started with comments about her appearance, supposedly compliments that made her skin crawl. Then came the inappropriate questions about her personal life, delivered with smirks that suggested they already knew more than they should. Tommy, who seemed to be their leader, had a particularly unsettling way of watching her move around the restaurant, his eyes tracking her every step like a predator sizing up prey. The worst part was how they had begun treating her during service. Last week, Tommy had grabbed her wrist when she brought his coffee, holding it just long enough to make his point clear while pretending it was an accident. Danny had started leaving messes deliberately, spilling things on the floor, and then commenting loudly about how clumsy the help was getting. And Steve, the quietest of the 3, had begun asking personal questions about her schedule, when she got off work, whether she walked home alone. Sarah had complained to Murphy, the 70-year-old owner who spent most of his time in the back office doing paperwork and pretending the restaurant wasn't slowly going bankrupt. His response had been predictable. They pay their bills and don't break anything. Deal with it. Easy words from someone who didn't have to serve them, didn't have to feel their eyes crawling over him like insects. Tonight felt different, though. There was an electricity in the air that had nothing to do with the storm raging outside. Tommy and his crew had been drinking before they arrived. She could smell the alcohol on their breath when they settled into their usual booth near the back. Their voices were louder than normal, their laughter more aggressive, and the way they kept looking at her made her stomach twist with anxiety. She tried to stay busy with other customers, refilling coffee cups and clearing tables with mechanical efficiency. Mrs. Chun, a regular who worked the late shift at the hospital, gave her a sympathetic smile as Sarah topped off her coffee. "You okay, honey? You look pale tonight." "Just tired," Sarah replied automatically, the lie sliding off her tongue as easily as breathing. She had become an expert at hiding her fear, at pretending everything was normal when her world felt like it was balanced on a knife's edge. The diner had emptied out considerably as the night wore on. Mrs. Chen had left around 9:30, and the trucker who usually occupied the corner booth had paid his bill and headed back to the highway. Now it was just Sarah, Murphy in the back office, and the 3 men who had been steadily working their way through a pot of coffee while their conversation grew increasingly vulgar and directed at her. "Hey, beautiful," Tommy called out, his voice carrying the exaggerated friendliness of someone who had been drinking. How about you come over here and sit with us for a minute? We're lonely. Sarah pretended not to hear him, focusing intently on wiping down the counter that was already spotless. Her heart was hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird, and she could feel sweat beating on her forehead despite the diner's perpetual chill. I'm talking to you. Tommy's voice had an edge to it now, the pretense of civility beginning to crack. Don't be rude. She looked up, forcing what she hoped was a professional smile. I'm sorry, I'm working. Can I get you gentlemen anything else? Danny laughed, a sound like broken glass. Yeah, you can get us some respect. We've been coming here for weeks, leaving good tips, being nice to you. The least you could do is be friendly back. I am being friendly, Sarah said, her voice smaller than she intended. She hated how weak she sounded, hated the way her fear was bleeding through despite her efforts to hide it. No, you're not. Steve spoke up for the first time, his quiet voice somehow more menacing than his friend's louder threats. You avoid us, you won't talk to us, you act like you're too good for us. That's not very nice. Sarah's hands were shaking now as she set down the rag she'd been clutching like a lifeline. The rational part of her brain was screaming at her to go get Murphy, to call the police, to do something other than stand there frozen like a deer in headlights. But her body wasn't listening to reason anymore. I think there's been a misunderstanding, she managed to say. I treat all customers the same way. I'm just here to do my job. Tommy slid out of the booth with the fluid grace of someone who had intimidated people before. Your job, he said, walking slowly toward the counter, is to make the customers happy. And we're not happy, Sarah. The fact that he knew her name, said it with such casual familiarity, made her blood run cold. She had never told him her name. It was written on her name tag, of course, but the way he said it suggested he knew more about her than just what was printed on a plastic badge. We know where you live, Danny added helpfully from the booth, confirming her worst fears. Nice little place on Elm Street. 3rd floor, apartment 3B. Must be tough, walking home alone every night through that neighborhood. Lots of dark alleys, broken streetlights. The world seemed to tilt sideways. They had been following her, watching her, learning her routines. The thought made her feel sick and violated in a way that went beyond physical fear. What do you want from me? The question came out as barely a whisper. Tommy had reached the counter now, close enough that she could smell the alcohol on his breath mixed with cheap cologne and something else, something predatory and wrong. We want to be friends, Sarah? Good friends. The kind of friends who look out for each other, who help each other out when times are tough. His hand reached across the counter toward her face, and every instinct in her body screamed at her to run. But there was nowhere to go. The kitchen was a dead end, Murphy's office was locked, and the front door might as well have been on the moon for all the good it would do her with 3 men between her and freedom. Don't touch me, she said, surprising herself with the firmness in her voice. Please just leave me alone. Tommy's expression hardened, the mask of false friendliness finally slipping completely. Nobody talks to me like that. Especially not some nobody waitress who should be grateful for the attention. That's when his hand shot out, not to caress, but to grab, his fingers closing around her wrist with bruising force. Sarah cried out in pain and fear, trying to pull away, but his grip was like iron. Let go of me. I don't think so, Tommy said, his voice dropping to a whisper that was somehow more terrifying than shouting. I think you need to learn some manners. The other 2 men had gotten up from their booth now, moving to flank her, cutting off any possible escape route. Steve had something in his hand, something metallic that caught the flickering fluorescent light in a way that made Sarah's stomach drop. Please, she whispered, her voice breaking with desperation. Please don't do this. I haven't done anything to you. You've been disrespectful, Danny said matter-of-factly. That's something. And disrespect has consequences. Through the rain-streaked windows, the outside world continued its normal existence, completely unaware of the nightmare unfolding inside Murphy's diner. Cars passed by occasionally, their headlights sweeping across the walls like searchlights, but they never slowed, never stopped. Sarah was alone with these men and their twisted idea of justice. Murphy, she called out desperately, hoping against hope that the old man would hear her and come running. But Murphy was hard of hearing, and his office was at the back of the restaurant. Even if he did hear something, he would probably assume it was just the normal noise of the dinner service. Tommy's grip on her wrist tightened, and he started to pull her around the counter, toward the back of the restaurant where there were no windows, no possibility that someone might see what was happening. "Come on, Sarah," he said in a mockingly gentle tone. "Time for your lesson in customer service." That's when the front door chimed. Everyone froze. Tommy's grip loosened slightly as all four of them turned toward the entrance, where a figure was shaking rain from an expensive-looking coat. The newcomer was tall, well-dressed in a way that immediately marked him as different from the diner's usual clientele. His suit was perfectly tailored, his shoes were leather, and probably cost more than Sarah made in a month, and there was something about the way he carried himself that suggested money and power. "We're closed," Tommy called out, his voice still carrying some of its earlier menace, but now with an undertone of uncertainty. The man looked up, and Sarah found herself staring into the most striking pair of gray eyes she had ever seen. They were sharp, intelligent, and, as they swept the scene in front of him, they seemed to take in everything. Tommy's hand on her wrist, the fear written across her face, the predatory stance of the other two men. "The sign says you're open until 11, the stranger said calmly, checking his watch. "It's 10:15. Tommy's jaw worked as he tried to figure out how to handle this unexpected complication. He couldn't very well drag Sarah into the back room with a witness present, but he also couldn't let go of her without losing face in front of his crew. "We're not serving food anymore," Danny said. "Kitchen's closed." The stranger smiled, but there was something cold about it, something that made Sarah think of winter mornings and sharp edges. "That's fine. I just need coffee. Black." He moved to one of the counter stools with fluid grace, settling himself as if he planned to stay for a while. His presence seemed to fill the space, commanding attention in a way that had nothing to do with volume or aggression. It was the quiet confidence of someone accustomed to being the most important person in any room. Tommy was caught in an impossible position. He couldn't continue what he'd started with a witness present, but backing down now would be a humiliation he'd never lived down. His grip on Sarah's wrist loosened fractionally as he tried to decide what to do next. "Sarah," the stranger said quietly, and she startled at hearing her name from someone who shouldn't have known it. "I think there might have been some kind of misunderstanding here." His voice was cultured, educated, with the kind of accent that spoke of private schools and old money. But underneath the refinement, there was something else, something that made Tommy take an unconscious step backward. "No misunderstanding," Tommy said, but his voice had lost some of its earlier certainty. "Just having a conversation with our favorite waitress." "It looks like an uncomfortable conversation," the stranger observed, his gray eyes never leaving Tommy's face. "Perhaps it would be better continued at another time, in another place." The suggestion hung in the air like a challenge. Sarah could feel the tension ratcheting up another notch as the two men sized each other up. Tommy was clearly the type who was used to being the biggest fish in his small pond, but this newcomer radiated a different kind of power entirely. "Who are you supposed to be?" Steve asked from his position near the kitchen, his hand still clutching whatever weapon he'd been concealing. The stranger reached into his jacket, a movement so casual and confident that it took a moment for Sarah to realize what he was doing. When his hand emerged, it held a simple black leather wallet, which he flipped open to reveal a thick stack of bills. "I'm someone who pays well for good service and privacy," he said simply, "and someone who doesn't like to see young women being manhandled in restaurants." He pulled out several $100 bills and placed them on the counter with deliberate precision. "I think these gentlemen were just leaving." The money sat there like a gauntlet thrown down, a challenge and an offer all at once. Sarah could see Tommy's mind working, weighing his options. He could escalate the situation, but this newcomer clearly wasn't some random customer who could be easily intimidated. The expensive clothes, the casual display of cash, the quiet confidence all spoke of someone with resources and connections. More importantly, other people might start arriving soon. The late-night crowd would begin trickling in within the next hour, and whatever Tommy had planned would become impossible with witnesses around. "This isn't over," Tommy said finally, releasing Sarah's wrist with a gesture that was meant to look casual rather than like the retreat it actually was. "I certainly hope it is," the stranger replied with the same unnerving smile. "It would be unfortunate if there were any misunderstandings about that." The three men filed out of the diner with as much dignity as they could muster, but Sarah could see the frustration and rage in their movements. This was a postponement, not a cancellation, and they all knew it. As soon as the door closed behind them, Sarah's legs gave out. She sank onto the stool behind the counter, her whole body shaking with the aftermath of adrenaline and terror. The stranger watched her with those piercing gray eyes, his expression unreadable. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't. Are you hurt?" His question was direct, professional, like a doctor assessing a patient. Sarah looked down at her wrist, where Tommy's fingers had left red marks that were already beginning to darken into bruises. "I'm okay. Just scared." The stranger nodded, pulling out his phone. "I'm calling the police." "No." The word came out sharper than she intended, and she saw his eyebrows rise in surprise. "I mean, please don't. It will just make things worse." "How could involving the police make things worse?" Sarah laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You don't understand. This isn't some nice neighborhood where the police actually help people like me. Tommy and his friends, they have connections. Calling the cops will just make them angry, and they know where I live." The stranger studied her face for a long moment, and she had the uncomfortable feeling that he was reading far more than she wanted to reveal. "What's your name?" "Sarah Martinez." "Sarah," he repeated, as if testing the sound of it. "I'm going to give you my card. If those men bother you again, I want you to call me immediately." He reached into his jacket and produced a simple white business card, placing it on the counter next to the money he'd used to buy her freedom. Sarah picked it up with trembling fingers, reading the elegant script. Alexander Hayes, Hayes International Holdings. The name meant nothing to her, but something about the way he'd presented the card suggested it should have. "What kind of business do you do, Mr. Hayes?" "I solve problems," he said simply. "And, right now, you have a problem." Before she could ask what he meant by that, the kitchen door swung open, and Murphy shuffled out, looking annoyed. "Sarah, what's all the noise out here?" "I'm trying to do the books." She looked at Murphy's oblivious face, then at the business card in her hand, then at the mysterious stranger who had somehow known exactly what to do when her world had been falling apart. "Nothing, Murphy. Just a difficult customer. Mr. Hayes here was just leaving." The next morning arrived gray and lifeless, matching Sarah's mood as she stood in front of her bathroom mirror, trying to cover the bruises on her wrist with makeup. The purple marks had darkened overnight, a vivid reminder of how close she had come to something far worse than humiliation. She had barely slept, jumping at every sound from the street below, her mind replaying the events at the diner over and over like a broken record. The business card Alexander Hayes had given her sat on her kitchen table next to her untouched breakfast, its pristine whiteness a stark contrast to the chipped formica surface. She had spent half the night staring at it, wondering what kind of man carried himself with such quiet authority, what kind of business required cards without phone numbers or addresses beyond the company name. Hayes International Holdings. She had tried looking it up on her ancient laptop, but the internet connection in her building was spotty at best, and what little information she could find seemed deliberately vague. The company appeared to be involved in acquisitions and investments, with offices in major cities around the world. Alexander Hayes himself was mentioned in a few business articles, always in passing, always without much detail. He was described as reclusive, brilliant, and ruthlessly effective, but the articles read more like carefully crafted press releases than actual journalism. What bothered her most wasn't what she had found, but what she hadn't. For a man who seemed to wield considerable influence, Alexander Hayes maintained a remarkably low profile. There were no social media accounts, no gossip column mentions, no candid photographs from charity events or business conferences. It was as if he existed in the shadows between the public and private worlds, visible only when he chose to be. The walk to work felt different that morning. Every car that slowed down made her heart race. Every figure in a doorway could have been one of Tommy's crew waiting for her. She found herself taking a circuitous route, ducking through alleys and side streets she normally avoided, anything to make herself a harder target to track. Murphy's diner looked exactly the same in the harsh light of day, but Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had changed. The booth where Tommy and his friends had sat seemed to radiate menace even when empty. And she caught herself glancing nervously at the front door every few minutes, expecting to see their familiar silhouettes. Murphy himself was in a foul mood, grumbling about the previous night's receipts and complaining about the cost of everything from coffee beans to napkins. He barely looked up when Sarah arrived, already lost in the endless calculations that kept his failing restaurant limping along one day at a time. "You're late," he muttered without checking the time. "5 minutes," Sarah replied, tying on her apron with hands that were steadier than she felt. "I had trouble sleeping." Murphy grunted in response, already back to his ledger books. Sarah had worked for him long enough to recognize the signs. When the numbers didn't add up, when the bills outweighed the income, when the weight of keeping the place afloat pressed down on his shoulders like a physical burden. In those moments, he became even more withdrawn than usual, retreating into the familiar comfort of denial and small economies that would never be enough to solve the real problems. The morning shift passed in a blur of routine tasks and nervous glances toward the door. The regular customers came and went as they always did. Construction workers grabbing coffee and donuts before heading to job sites. Office workers stopping for a quick breakfast before diving into another day of corporate tedium. Elderly retirees who came as much for the human contact as the food. Mrs. Patterson, a widow in her 70s who had been coming to Murphy's since before Sarah started working there, noticed her distraction right away. "You seem jumpy today, dear," she said as Sarah refilled her coffee cup for the third time in an hour. "Everything all right?" Sarah managed a weak smile. "Just tired. Had some trouble with difficult customers last night." Mrs. Patterson's eyes sharpened with concern. "What kind of trouble?" "You know, when I was your age, there were men who thought they could take advantage of young women working alone. Most of them were cowards, but some." She trailed off, studying Sarah's face. "You be careful, honey. There are dangerous people in this world, and sometimes being polite isn't enough to protect yourself." The older woman's words stayed with Sarah throughout the morning, echoing in her mind as she went through the motions of serving food and making conversation. Mrs. Patterson was right, of course. Being polite, being professional, following the rules. None of it mattered when you were dealing with people who didn't recognize any authority but force. Around noon, just as the lunch rush was beginning to pick up, Sarah noticed a black sedan parked across the street from the diner. It had been there for almost an hour, its windows tinted dark enough to hide whoever was inside. Every time she looked out the window, she could feel eyes watching her, studying her movements, learning her routines all over again. Her hands began to shake as she carried a tray of food to a table near the front windows. Were they back already? Had they spent the morning planning their next move, figuring out how to deal with the interference from Alexander Hayes? The lunch crowd provided some comfort through sheer numbers. Tommy and his crew might be dangerous, but they weren't stupid enough to try anything with dozens of witnesses around. Still, Sarah found herself staying close to the kitchen, avoiding the front windows, jumping every time the door chimed to announce a new customer. It was during the afternoon lull, when most of the lunch customers had returned to their jobs, and the diner had settled into its familiar quiet rhythm, that Sarah made her decision. She pulled Alexander Hayes's business card from her apron pocket and studied it one more time, trying to read between the lines of its elegant simplicity. He had said to call if Tommy and his friends bothered her again. Did watching her from across the street count as bothering her? Did the constant fear, the looking over her shoulder, the knowledge that they knew where she lived and when she worked, did any of that qualify as harassment worth reporting to a stranger who might or might not be able to help? The rational part of her mind said no. She was being paranoid, jumping at shadows, letting fear rule her life over what might be nothing more than a coincidence. The black sedan could belong to anyone. The feeling of being watched could be her imagination running wild after a traumatic experience. But the growing knot of anxiety in her stomach said otherwise. These weren't the kind of men who gave up easily, who walked away from a confrontation without trying to save face. Alexander Hayes might have bought her time, but he hadn't solved the underlying problem. If anything, he might have made it worse by humiliating them in public. The afternoon stretched on with agonizing slowness. Every car that passed the diner could have been circling back for another look. Every customer who entered could have been a scout, checking to see if she was alone, if Murphy was in the back office, if the coast was clear for whatever they had planned. By 4 o'clock, Sarah couldn't take it anymore. The black sedan was still parked across the street, and her nerves were stretched to the breaking point. She told Murphy she needed a smoke break, a lie, since she'd never smoked a cigarette in her life, and slipped out the back door into the narrow alley that ran behind the restaurant. The alley was a depressing corridor of dumpsters and fire escapes, littered with debris and reeking of garbage that hadn't been collected in too long. But it was private, hidden from the street, and whatever eyes might be watching from the sedan. Sarah pulled out her phone and dialed the number on Alexander Hayes's business card, her heart hammering as it rang once, twice, 3 times. Just as she was beginning to think it would go to voicemail, a familiar voice answered. "Hayes. Mr. Hayes? This is Sarah Martinez. From the diner last night." "Sarah." His tone changed immediately, becoming more alert, more focused. "Are you all right?" "I think so. I mean, they haven't approached me directly, but there's been a car parked outside the diner all day, and I have the feeling I'm being watched." "What kind of car?" "Black sedan. Tinted windows. It's been there for hours." There was a pause, and Sarah could hear what sounded like typing in the background. "Where are you now?" "In the alley behind Murphy's. I didn't want to call from inside in case they could see me." "Good instinct. I need you to listen carefully, Sarah. Go back inside, and stay there until your shift ends. Don't leave alone, and don't take your usual route home. Is there somewhere else you can stay tonight? A friend's place, family?" The questions came rapid fire, with the precision of someone accustomed to dealing with dangerous situations. "I don't have many friends, and my family." Sarah's voice trailed off. Her mother had died 2 years ago, and her father had never been in the picture. She was essentially alone in the world, which was probably part of why Tommy and his crew had targeted her in the first place. "A hotel, then," Alexander continued without missing a beat. "Somewhere they wouldn't think to look. Do you have enough money for a room?" Sarah almost laughed at the question. She barely had enough money to keep her apartment, let alone waste it on hotel rooms. "Not really." Another pause. "I'm sending someone to help you. His name is Marcus, and he'll be driving a silver BMW. He'll park in front of the diner at exactly 6:30 when your shift ends. Get in the car with him immediately. Don't hesitate. Don't look around for your watchers. Just move quickly and get in." "Wait," Sarah said, panic creeping into her voice. "I don't know you. I don't know this Marcus person. How do I know you're not just as dangerous as they are?" It was a fair question, one that had been lurking in the back of her mind since the previous night. Alexander Hayes had appeared at exactly the right moment, known exactly what to say, handled the situation with a competence that suggested experience with similar scenarios. What kind of legitimate businessman was that prepared for violence and intimidation? "You don't know," Alexander admitted. "But, right now, I'm the only option you have. Tommy Ricci isn't going to give up, Sarah. Men like him see backing down as weakness, and weakness invites attack. If you stay in your normal routine, if you try to handle this alone, something bad is going to happen." "How do you know his name?" Sarah asked, though part of her already suspected the answer. "Because I made it my business to know. Tommy Ricci has a record: assault, extortion, harassment. He's been arrested 4 times in the past 3 years, but the charges never seem to stick. His uncle is connected to some unpleasant people, which gives him more protection than a petty criminal should have." The casual way Alexander recited the information sent chills down Sarah's spine. This wasn't public record information that anyone could look up. This was the kind of detailed intelligence that required resources, connections, and a level of access that ordinary citizens didn't possess. "What are you?" she whispered. "Who are you, really?" "I'm someone who has resources that most people don't," Alexander replied. "And, right now, I'm willing to use those resources to help you. The question is whether you're willing to accept that help." Sarah closed her eyes, leaning against the brick wall of the alley as she tried to process everything. She was caught between 2 unknowns: Tommy Ricci, whose intentions were clearly malicious, and Alexander Hayes, whose motives remained mysterious but who had already proven he could protect her when she needed it most. "Why?" she asked finally. "Why do you care what happens to a waitress you met once?" The silence stretched long enough that Sarah began to wonder if the call had been dropped. When Alexander finally spoke, His voice carried a weight that suggested old pain, carefully controlled but never forgotten. Let's just say I understand what it's like to be powerless against people who think they can take whatever they want. I swore a long time ago that I would help people in that situation when I could. It wasn't a complete answer, but there was something in his tone that made Sarah believe him. Whatever his story was, whatever had shaped him into the man who could make Tommy Ricci back down with nothing more than presence and confidence, it had given him a personal understanding of her situation. Silver BMW, she repeated. 6:30. 6:30, Alexander confirmed. And Sarah? If anything changes, if they approach you before then, call me immediately. Don't try to handle it yourself. The line went dead, leaving Sarah alone in the alley with her fears and the growing realization that her life had taken a turn into territory she didn't understand. She made her way back into the diner, trying to project normalcy while her mind raced with questions and possibilities. The black sedan was still there, still watching, still waiting. But now Sarah had something she hadn't had that morning, a plan. It might lead her into deeper trouble, but it was better than the passive terror that had been consuming her since the previous night. The remaining hours of her shift crawled by with agonizing slowness. Every glance at the clock seemed to move the hands backward rather than forward. Murphy emerged from his office occasionally to check on things, but he was too lost in his own problems to notice Sarah's distraction. At 6:25, Sarah began untying her apron with trembling hands. Through the front windows, she could see the black sedan still in position, its occupants no doubt wondering why she was getting ready to leave 10 minutes early. At 6:28, she gathered her purse and jacket, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. And then, at exactly 6:30, a silver BMW pulled up in front of Murphy's diner. Sarah took a deep breath, said a silent prayer to whatever powers might be listening, and walked toward the door. Whatever happened next, whatever Alexander Hayes' true agenda might be, it had to be better than the slow torture of waiting for Tommy Ricci to make his next move. The man behind the wheel of the BMW was not what she had expected. Marcus appeared to be in his 40s, with graying temples and the kind of weathered face that spoke of experience with difficult situations. He was wearing a simple black suit and had the alert, professional bearing of someone accustomed to following orders and handling complications. As Sarah approached the car, he leaned across to open the passenger door for her. "Ms. Martinez? Mr. Hayes sent me." Sarah hesitated for just a moment, acutely aware that she was about to cross a line from which there might be no return. Then, she thought of Tommy's hands on her wrist, of the black sedan that had been watching her all day, of the fear that had become her constant companion. She got in the car. Marcus pulled away from the curb with smooth efficiency, and Sarah watched Murphy's diner disappear in the rearview mirror. The black sedan started to follow, just as she had known it would, but Marcus seemed completely unconcerned. The silver BMW wound through the city streets with the precision of someone who knew exactly where surveillance cameras were positioned and which routes would provide the most cover. Marcus drove with the calm competence of a professional, occasionally checking his mirrors, but never appearing concerned about their pursuit. Within 20 minutes, the black sedan had disappeared entirely, lost in the maze of downtown traffic and one-way streets. Sarah watched the familiar landmarks of her neighborhood give way to areas she rarely visited. Upscale shopping districts with designer boutiques, tree-lined avenues where the houses cost more than she would make in a lifetime, and, finally, the financial district where gleaming towers of glass and steel reached toward the evening sky, like monuments to corporate power. "Where exactly are we going?" Sarah asked as Marcus guided the BMW into the underground garage of a building that seemed to stretch impossibly high above them. "Mr. Hayes maintains an office here," Marcus replied, pulling into a parking space marked with a simple, reserved sign. He thought it would be more comfortable than meeting in public. The elevator that carried them to the 40th floor was paneled in rich mahogany and moved so smoothly that Sarah barely felt the ascent. When the doors opened, they revealed a reception area that looked like something from a high-end hotel. Persian rugs, leather furniture, and artwork that probably cost more than her annual salary. A woman in her 50s, impeccably dressed and radiating the kind of professional competence that came from years of managing important people's schedules, looked up from behind a desk that appeared to be carved from a single piece of black marble. "Ms. Martinez," she said with a warm smile that seemed genuine despite the formal setting. "Mr. Hayes is waiting for you in his office. Can I get you anything? Coffee, tea, water?" "Water would be nice," Sarah managed, her voice barely above a whisper. The opulence of her surroundings was overwhelming, making her acutely aware of her own appearance. The coffee-stained uniform, the worn shoes, the exhaustion that clung to her like a second skin. The woman, her nameplate read, Elizabeth Morrison, executive assistant, led Sarah down a hallway lined with what appeared to be original paintings, pausing in front of double doors made of the same rich wood as the elevator panels. "Mr. Hayes?" Elizabeth knocked softly. "Ms. Martinez is here. Send her in," came the familiar voice from beyond the doors. Sarah had expected Alexander's office to be impressive, but the reality exceeded her imagination. Floor-to-ceiling windows provided a panoramic view of the city, while the office itself was a study in understated elegance. The furniture was modern but comfortable, the artwork was subtle but clearly expensive, and everything was arranged with the kind of attention to detail that spoke of someone who valued perfection. Alexander Hayes stood behind his desk, silhouetted against the city lights. He had changed from the expensive suit he'd worn to the diner into something more casual, but no less elegant. Dark slacks, and a white shirt with the sleeves rolled up, revealing forearms that suggested he stayed in excellent physical condition despite his obvious wealth. "Sarah," he said, moving around the desk to greet her. "Thank you for trusting Marcus enough to come." Up close, in better lighting, Sarah could see details she had missed in the diner's fluorescent glare. Alexander was probably in his late 30s, with dark hair that showed just a touch of silver at the temples. His gray eyes were even more striking than she remembered, and there was something about his face that suggested intelligence, determination, and perhaps a capacity for ruthlessness that was carefully controlled but never completely hidden. "Please sit," he said, gesturing to a pair of leather chairs positioned near the windows. "I imagine you have questions." Sarah settled into the chair, which was so comfortable that she immediately felt some of the tension leave her shoulders. "A few thousand," she admitted. Alexander smiled, and this time there was genuine warmth in it. "Let's start with the basics. You want to know who I am, why I helped you, and what I want in return. That's a good start." He moved to a cabinet that proved to contain a small bar and poured himself what looked like whiskey from a crystal decanter. "Would you like something stronger than water? You've had a difficult day." Sarah shook her head. She needed to stay clear-headed for whatever conversation was about to unfold. "Very well." Alexander returned to his chair, cradling the glass in his hands. "As I told you, my name is Alexander Hayes. I'm the founder and primary shareholder of Hayes International Holdings, which is primarily an investment and acquisition firm. We specialize in taking over underperforming companies and either improving their operations or liquidating their assets." It sounded mundane, the kind of business description that could apply to hundreds of firms in the city. But something about the way he said it suggested there was more to the story. "That doesn't explain how you knew exactly what to do last night," Sarah said, "or how you got detailed information about Tommy Ricci so quickly, or why you have people like Marcus working for you." Alexander took a sip of his whiskey, considering his words carefully. "Hayes International operates in some challenging markets, Sarah. We sometimes find ourselves dealing with people who don't respect traditional business practices. Over the years, I've learned to be prepared for situations that require alternative approaches to problem solving. Alternative approaches. Security consultants, private investigators, occasionally law enforcement personnel who specialize in corporate protection. Marcus, for example, spent 15 years as a federal marshal before I hired him to head our security operations." The pieces were beginning to fit together, painting a picture of a man who operated on the edges of the legitimate business world, where corporate warfare sometimes involved more than just stock prices and hostile takeovers. "Why did you help me?" Sarah asked. "And don't say it's because you don't like bullies. There are bullies everywhere in this city, and I doubt you make a habit of rescuing random waitresses." Alexander was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the city lights as if they might provide the words he was looking for. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight that suggested old pain, carefully buried but never forgotten. "When I was 12 years old, My mother worked 3 jobs to keep food on the table and a roof over our heads. One of those jobs was as a cocktail waitress in a bar downtown, not far from where Murphy's Diner is now. The owner was a man named Vincent Carrera, who thought that paying my mother's wages gave him certain privileges. Sarah felt something cold settle in her stomach as she realized where the story was heading. Carrera had friends, connections that made him feel untouchable. When my mother refused his advances, he made her life hell. Cut her hours, made sure she got the worst shifts, the most difficult customers. When she finally quit, he made sure she couldn't find work anywhere else in the service industry. Alexander's jaw tightened slightly, the only outward sign of the anger that still burned beneath the surface after all these years. We lost our apartment. Ended up in a homeless shelter for 6 months while my mother tried to find work that Carrera's influence couldn't reach. I watched her spirit break a little more each day, watched her blame herself for a situation that was entirely his fault. What happened to him? Sarah asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer. Vincent Carrera died in a car accident when I was 17, Alexander said matter-of-factly. Very tragic. His brakes failed while he was driving down a mountain road. These things happen. The casual way he delivered the information made Sarah's blood run cold. There was no emotion in his voice, no suggestion of satisfaction or regret. It was simply a fact, delivered with the same tone he might have used to discuss the weather. Did you? I was 17 and poor, Alexander said, meeting her gaze directly. I had no money, no connections, no power to do anything about Vincent Carrera. But I swore that would change. I swore that one day I would have the resources to help people in situations like my mother's. The silence stretched between them as Sarah tried to process what she had just heard. Alexander Hayes wasn't just a successful businessman who happened to have good security. He was someone who had built an empire specifically to wage war against people who abused their power over the vulnerable. So when you saw what was happening last night, I saw my mother, 25 years ago, trapped by men who thought they could take whatever they wanted because no one would stop them. Alexander finished his whiskey and set the glass aside. The difference is that now I have the resources to do something about it. Elizabeth Morrison appeared in the doorway, carrying a tray with Sarah's water and what appeared to be a light meal. I thought you might be hungry, she said kindly. You missed dinner. Sarah realized with surprise that she was indeed hungry. The stress of the day had killed her appetite. But now that she was safe, or at least safer, her body was remembering its basic needs. Thank you, she said, accepting the sandwich and soup gratefully. This is very kind. Think nothing of it. Elizabeth replied before withdrawing and closing the doors behind her. As Sarah ate, Alexander continued his explanation. Tommy Ricci and his associates present a problem that goes beyond simple harassment. They're part of a network of small-time criminals who prey on people like you. Individuals with limited resources, no connections, no way to fight back effectively. You make it sound like an epidemic. In many ways, it is. The police are overworked and underfunded. The legal system is designed to protect people with money and connections. For someone in your situation, the official channels of help are often worse than useless. Sarah thought about her own experiences with authority figures, the way Murphy had dismissed her concerns, the way she had automatically rejected Alexander's suggestion to call the police. He was right. The system wasn't designed to protect people like her. So what do you propose to do about it? Alexander stood and moved back to the windows, looking out at the city spread below them. Tommy Ricci needs to understand that you are no longer a viable target. That continuing to harass you will result in consequences he's not prepared to handle. What kind of consequences? The kind that men like Tommy understand. He operates in a world where strength and reputation are everything. If his reputation is damaged, if he's seen as weak or ineffective, his ability to intimidate other people evaporates. Sarah set down her soup spoon, her appetite suddenly gone. You're talking about violence. I'm talking about communication, Alexander corrected. Violence is a language that Tommy and his friends speak fluently. Sometimes it's the only way to have a productive conversation with people like them. The casual way he discussed violence as a communication tool was deeply unsettling. Sarah had grown up in neighborhoods where violence was common, but it was usually desperate, emotional, uncontrolled. What Alexander was describing sounded clinical, calculated, professional. What do you want from me in return? She asked, because there had to be a catch. Men like Alexander Hayes didn't help people out of pure altruism, no matter what tragic backstories motivated them. Alexander returned to his chair, studying her face with those penetrating gray eyes. I want you to quit your job at Murphy's Diner. What? The suggestion caught her completely off guard. I need that job. I can barely afford my apartment as it is. I'm offering you a different job. Here, at Hayes International. Better pay, better hours, better working conditions. Sarah stared at him in disbelief. Doing what? I'm a high school dropout with no business experience. What could I possibly do in a place like this? You'd be surprised how valuable street smarts and good instincts can be in the business world, Alexander said. Elizabeth could use an assistant, someone who understands how to read people, how to recognize when something isn't right. The offer was tempting, almost too good to be true. A real job with regular hours and decent pay, in an environment where she wouldn't have to worry about aggressive customers or groping hands. But something about it felt wrong, like a trap disguised as salvation. There's a catch, she said. There's always a catch. The catch is that working for me means entering a world that can be dangerous. Hayes International has enemies, Sarah. People who would love to find leverage they could use against me. Anyone associated with me becomes a potential target. So I'd be trading Tommy Ricci for potentially worse problems. Possibly. But you'd also have protection that Tommy could never dream of penetrating. And you'd have the satisfaction of knowing that you were helping other people in situations similar to yours. Sarah looked around the opulent office, at the city lights twinkling beyond the windows, at the man who had appeared in her life like something from a fairy tale. It was everything she had never dared to dream of, offered by someone who might be her salvation or her destruction. I need time to think about it, she said finally. Alexander nodded as if he had expected that response. Of course. But I should mention that Tommy Ricci isn't going to wait while you make up your mind. Marcus's people have been keeping an eye on him since this morning, and he's been making phone calls, reaching out to contacts, planning something. What kind of something? The kind that usually happens when men like Tommy feel their authority has been challenged. He's going to escalate. Sarah, if you go back to your normal routine, if you return to Murphy's Diner and your apartment, you're going to be walking into a trap. The weight of the choice settled on Sarah's shoulders like a physical burden. Stay in her old life and face whatever Tommy had planned, or accept Alexander's offer and enter a world she didn't understand, with dangers she couldn't predict. Where would I stay tonight? She asked. Assuming I need time to decide. I own a small apartment building about 20 minutes from here. Secure, comfortable, and completely isolated from Tommy's sphere of influence. You'd be safe there while you make up your mind. It was a temporary solution, but it bought her time. Time to think, to plan, to figure out how to navigate the impossible choice that had been thrust upon her. Okay, Sarah said. Just for tonight. Alexander smiled. But there was something in his expression that suggested he knew her decision was already made, that the events of the past 2 days had set her on a path from which there was no turning back. Marcus will drive you there, he said, standing as she gathered her things. And Sarah? Don't feel like you have to decide everything tonight. Some choices take time to reveal their true nature. As they waited for the elevator, Sarah found herself wondering if Sarah woke before dawn in the unfamiliar apartment, her body clock still tuned to the rhythms of a life that already felt like it belonged to someone else. The bed was more comfortable than anything she had ever slept on. The sheets were softer than silk, and the silence was so complete that it took her a moment to remember where she was and why she was there. The events of the previous evening felt surreal in the gray light of early morning. Had she really sat in Alexander Hayes' office, listening to him offer her a new life, while casually admitting to what sounded like murder? Had she really agreed to stay in his apartment, to consider abandoning everything she knew for a world she didn't understand? She padded to the kitchen in her bare feet, finding it stocked with fresh coffee and breakfast items that were far better quality than anything in her own refrigerator. As she waited for the coffee to brew, she found herself studying the apartment more carefully than she had the night before. It was beautiful, certainly, but there was something impersonal about it, like a high-end hotel room that was designed to be comfortable without revealing anything about its occupant. The artwork was professionally selected, The furniture was expensive, but generic, and there were no personal touches anywhere to be seen. It was a place designed for temporary occupancy, for people who needed to disappear for a while without leaving any traces behind. The realization sent a chill down Sarah's spine. How many people had Alexander Hayes helped over the years? How many frightened waitresses and vulnerable workers had sat in this same kitchen, drinking this same coffee, trying to decide whether to accept his protection? And, more importantly, what had happened to them afterward? Her phone buzzed with a text message, and Sarah's heart jumped before she realized it was from Murphy. "Where the hell are you? Your shift started an hour ago." She stared at the message, trying to figure out how to respond. Calling in sick would buy her time, but it would also mean going back eventually, returning to the world where Tommy Ricci was waiting for her. The thought made her stomach clench with anxiety. Before she could decide what to say, there was a knock at the door. Sarah froze, her coffee cup halfway to her lips. Nobody knew she was here except Alexander and Marcus. Unless, "Ms. Martinez?" came a familiar voice. "It's Marcus. Mr. Hayes sent me to check on you." Sarah opened the door to find Marcus holding a newspaper and what appeared to be a bag of fresh pastries. He was dressed in the same professional black suit as the day before, but, in the morning light, she could see details she had missed. The slight bulge under his jacket that suggested a shoulder holster. The way his eyes automatically scanned the hallway before focusing on her. The alert posture of someone always prepared for trouble. "Good morning," he said with a polite smile. "I hope you slept well. Mr. Hayes thought you might want to see this." He handed her the newspaper, folded open to a small item in the Metro section. The headline read, "Local man injured in hit and run accident." The accompanying text was brief. Thomas Ricci, 32, was struck by a vehicle while crossing Main Street last night around 11 p.m. The driver fled the scene. Mr. Ricci is in stable condition at General Hospital with 2 broken legs and a concussion. Police are asking for witnesses to come forward. Sarah read the article twice, her hands beginning to shake. "Is this? Mr. Hayes wanted you to know that Tommy Ricci won't be bothering anyone for a while," Marcus said matter-of-factly. "Broken legs take time to heal, and hospital bills can be very expensive for someone without good insurance." The casual way he delivered the information was terrifying. This wasn't coincidence or karma or bad luck. This was deliberate, calculated violence disguised as an accident, carried out with the kind of precision that suggested experience and resources. "You hit him with a car," Sarah whispered. "I wasn't driving," Marcus replied, which wasn't exactly a denial. "But even if I had been, it would be very difficult to prove. There are no cameras on that particular stretch of Main Street, no witnesses who got a good look at the vehicle, and no physical evidence linking any specific car to the accident." Sarah sank into a chair, the full implications of what had happened crashing over her like a wave. Alexander Hayes hadn't just offered to help her. He had already taken action, sending a message that was impossible to misunderstand. Tommy Ricci was in a hospital bed with broken bones because he had dared to threaten someone under Alexander's protection. What about his friends, Danny and Steve? "They received phone calls this morning," Marcus said. Brief conversations explaining that their association with Mr. Ricci had become a liability. "They've both left town for extended vacations. You threatened them." "I provided them with information that helped them make informed decisions about their futures." Sometimes people just need the right data to realize that a change of scenery would be beneficial. The euphemisms made it worse somehow. The clinical way Marcus discussed violence and intimidation as if they were standard business practices, which Sarah was beginning to understand. They probably were in Alexander's world. "Mr. Hayes would like to see you this morning," Marcus continued. "When you're ready. There are some things he needs to discuss with you about your situation." Sarah looked down at her rumpled clothes, acutely aware that she was wearing the same outfit from yesterday. "I need to shower and change first." "Of course. There are clothes in the bedroom closet that should fit you. Mr. Hayes had Elizabeth select them yesterday evening." Another demonstration of Alexander's thoroughness, his ability to anticipate needs and solve problems before they became complications. It should have been reassuring, but, instead, it made Sarah feel like a chess piece being moved around a board according to someone else's strategy. An hour later, dressed in clothes that fit perfectly and cost more than she typically spent on clothing in 6 months, Sarah found herself back in Alexander's office. He was standing at the windows again, but this time he wasn't alone. A woman in her 30s sat in one of the leather chairs, reviewing what appeared to be legal documents. "Sarah," Alexander said, turning as she entered, "I'd like you to meet Jennifer Walsh, our chief legal counsel. She's been helping me work out some details regarding your situation." Jennifer stood to shake Sarah's hand, and her grip was firm and professional. She had the kind of sharp, intelligent eyes that suggested she was very good at her job, whatever that job actually entailed. "Ms. Martinez," Jennifer said, "I understand you've had a difficult few days. Mr. Hayes has asked me to explain some options that might help resolve your situation permanently." "What kind of options?" "Legal ones, primarily," Jennifer replied, settling back into her chair and consulting her notes. "Tommy Ricci has an extensive criminal record, but, as Mr. Hayes mentioned, most of the charges haven't stuck. However, his recent accident has created some new opportunities." She pulled out a photograph that made Sarah's stomach clench. It showed Tommy lying in a hospital bed, his legs in casts, his face bruised and swollen. Hospital records indicate that Mr. Ricci had a significant amount of cocaine in his system at the time of the accident. Combined with the outstanding warrant for his arrest on an unrelated assault charge, which mysteriously appeared in the system this morning, he's going to be spending considerable time in jail once he's medically cleared. Sarah stared at the photograph, trying to process what she was hearing. "You planted drugs on him?" "The hospital conducted a standard toxicology screening," Jennifer said carefully. "What they found was what they found. I can't comment on how those substances might have entered his system." "And the outstanding warrant?" "Sometimes paperwork gets misfiled for months or even years before it's properly processed. Bureaucratic errors are unfortunately common in our legal system." The casual way Jennifer discussed what were obviously fabricated charges was even more unsettling than Marcus's euphemisms about violence. These people operated in a world where laws were suggestions, where evidence could be created or destroyed according to need, where justice was something that could be purchased and delivered to order. "What about his friends?" Sarah asked. "Danny and Steve? They've both decided to relocate to other cities," Alexander said. Marcus was very persuasive in helping them understand that their futures lay elsewhere. "So this is over?" Just like that. Alexander exchanged glances with Jennifer before answering. "The immediate threat is neutralized, yes. But, Sarah, you need to understand that what happened to Tommy Ricci is going to attract attention. People are going to ask questions about who had the power to arrange such a comprehensive resolution to his problems." "What kind of people?" "The kind who don't appreciate independent operators moving into their territory," Jennifer said. "Tommy might have been small-time, but he was connected to larger organizations. His uncle, Vincent Carrera Jr., has significant influence in certain circles." Sarah felt her blood run cold at the familiar name. "Carrera? As in Vincent Carrera who made my mother's life hell 25 years ago," Alexander finished. "Yes. Vincent Jr. is the son of the man who destroyed my mother's life. The son of the man who died in that unfortunate car accident when I was 17. The connections were too perfect to be coincidental." Alexander hadn't just stumbled across Sarah's situation at random. He had been hunting the Carrera family for decades, and Tommy Ricci's harassment of a waitress had provided him with the excuse he needed to make his next move in a very long game of revenge. "You used me," Sarah said, the realization hitting her like a physical blow. "This was never about helping me. It was about getting to the Carrera family." Alexander was quiet for a long moment, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight of old pain and carefully controlled anger. "It was about both. Sarah, what happened to you was real. The danger you were in was real. The fact that helping you also served my larger purposes doesn't diminish that. But you would have helped me anyway, even if there hadn't been a Carrera connection." The silence that followed was answer enough. Sarah felt sick, realizing how completely she had been manipulated. Alexander's story about his mother, his offer of protection, his generous apartment, and new job, all of it had been calculated moves in a chess game she hadn't even known she was playing. "Vincent Jr. is going to retaliate," Jennifer said, apparently deciding that brutal honesty was the best policy. "When Tommy Ricci's accident is connected to Mr. Hayes, when Vincent realizes who was responsible, he's going to respond. And Since you were the catalyst for this particular conflict, you're going to be a target. So now I need protection from people I've never even met because of things that happened before I was born? Unfortunately, yes, Alexander said. Which brings us to our original offer. Working for Hayes International will provide you with security that you can't get anywhere else. And it will give us the ability to monitor and control your environment. Control my environment, Sarah repeated. You mean control me? I mean protect you, Alexander corrected. But there was something in his tone that suggested the distinction might be smaller than he was claiming. Sarah stood and walked to the windows, looking out at the city that had seemed so beautiful the night before and now felt like a prison. Every choice led to the same conclusion. Accept Alexander's protection and become a prisoner of his war with the Carrera family, or refuse and become a casualty of that same war. What if I just left, she asked. What if I took what money I have and moved to another city, started over somewhere else? Vincent Jr. has a long memory and significant resources, Jennifer replied. Geographic distance wouldn't necessarily provide the protection you think it would. So my choices are to work for you, or to spend the rest of my life looking over my shoulder? Those appear to be the available options, Alexander said. I'm sorry, Sarah. I truly am. If I could have resolved Tommy's harassment without triggering this larger conflict, I would have. Sarah turned back to face him, searching his expression for any sign of deception. What she saw was something that might have been genuine regret, carefully controlled, but apparently real. If I agree to work for you, what exactly would that involve? Initially, you'd work with Elizabeth, learning the administrative side of our operations. Over time, if you prove capable and trustworthy, you might be given more responsibility, more insight into how we actually function. And if I prove incapable or untrustworthy? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Alexander met her gaze directly, and, for a moment, the careful polish of the successful businessman slipped, revealing something harder and more dangerous underneath. Let's focus on the positive possibilities, he said finally. It wasn't an answer, but it was answer enough. Sarah understood now that accepting Alexander's offer meant entering a world from which there might be no exit, where loyalty was mandatory and betrayal was fatal. But the alternative was worse. The alternative was living in constant fear, always waiting for Vincent Carrera Jr. to decide that her continued existence was an insult that needed to be corrected. I'll need to go back to my apartment, she said, to get my things. I'll have Marcus arrange for a team to pack everything and bring it here, Alexander replied. It's not safe for you to return to your old neighborhood. What about Murphy? I can't just disappear without saying anything. Jennifer consulted her notes. Mr. Murphy will receive a call this afternoon informing him that you've been offered a position with a company in another state and had to leave immediately. He'll also receive a generous payment to cover any inconvenience caused by your sudden departure. Even that detail had been anticipated and planned for. Sarah wondered if there was any aspect of her life that Alexander hadn't considered, any contingency he hadn't prepared for. And if I say no to all of this? If I decide to take my chances on my own? Alexander was quiet for a moment, studying her face with those penetrating gray eyes. Then, I wish you luck, and I hope you're better at staying hidden than most people are. It wasn't a threat, exactly, but it wasn't reassurance either. It was simply a statement of fact. The world Sarah had inadvertently entered was one where individual choices mattered less than larger forces, where personal safety was a luxury that required constant vigilance and significant resources. I need some time to think, Sarah said, though they all knew what her decision would be. The illusion of choice was a courtesy, nothing more. Of course, Alexander replied. Take all the time you need. Marcus 6 months later, Sarah Martinez stood in her new office on the 38th floor of the Hayes International Building, watching the city spread out below her like a map of possibilities she was only beginning to understand. The woman who had once trembled behind the counter at Murphy's Diner seemed like a character from someone else's story, a frightened girl whose biggest worry had been making rent rather than managing the complex web of information that now flowed across her desk every day. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. Those first few weeks working as Elizabeth Morrison's assistant had been a careful dance of learning new rhythms, new languages, new ways of thinking about power and influence. Elizabeth had been patient, but demanding, teaching Sarah not just how to manage Alexander's schedule and correspondence, but how to read between the lines of seemingly innocent business communications. When someone says they're exploring alternative options, Elizabeth had explained during one of their early training sessions, they're usually threatening to do business with our competitors. When they mention that they've been reviewing our relationship, they want something we haven't given them. And when they suggest a face-to-face meeting to discuss mutual concerns, they're planning to try to intimidate us. Sarah had learned quickly that Hayes International operated in multiple dimensions simultaneously. There was the legitimate business, the acquisitions, the investments, the corporate restructuring that generated the money that powered everything else. But underneath that respectable surface was something more complex, a network of favors and obligations, information and influence, protection and consequences that touched every aspect of Alexander's empire. The first time she had witnessed that shadow world in action, it had been through a seemingly routine phone call. Alexander had been in a meeting with potential investors when Marcus had knocked on his office door with an urgent message. Sarah, working at her desk in the outer office, had heard only fragments of the conversation that followed. The Peterson situation, Alexander had said, his voice carrying the calm authority that Sarah had learned meant serious trouble for someone. How certain are we about the evidence? Marcus had murmured something too quiet to overhear, but Alexander's response had been clear enough. Then, Mr. Peterson needs to understand that his current course of action is incompatible with his family's continued well-being. 24 hours later, the newspapers had reported that City Councilman Robert Peterson had abruptly withdrawn his support for a zoning ordinance that would have blocked one of Hayes International's development projects. The official reason given was new information that raised concerns about the environmental impact. The unofficial reason, Sarah had gradually understood, was that Peterson had received photographs of his teenage daughter walking alone to school, along with detailed information about her daily routines and the security gaps that made her vulnerable. No threats had been explicitly made. No violence had been suggested. But the message had been unmistakably clear: cooperate, or face consequences that extended far beyond business concerns. Sarah had found herself both horrified and fascinated by the elegant ruthlessness of it all. Alexander never ordered anyone killed, never had people beaten or kidnapped. Instead, he applied pressure with surgical precision, finding exactly the right leverage to achieve his goals while maintaining plausible deniability about his methods. The key, he had explained to her during one of their weekly strategy meetings, is to understand what people actually value. Most men will sacrifice almost anything to protect their reputations. Most women will do anything to protect their children. Most politicians will abandon any principle to avoid scandal. Once you understand someone's core vulnerability, influence becomes a matter of careful application of pressure. The weekly strategy meetings had been another surprise. Sarah had assumed that working as Elizabeth's assistant would mean filing papers and answering phones, not sitting in on discussions about corporate espionage and political manipulation. But Alexander had made it clear from the beginning that he didn't believe in compartmentalization. Everyone who works for me needs to understand the full scope of our operations, he had said during her second week. We'll be available if you have any questions or concerns. As Sarah left the office, she found herself wondering when exactly she had stopped being a person and become a problem to be managed. Was it when Tommy first grabbed her wrist? When Alexander walked through the diner door? Or was it 25 years ago, when a frightened boy had sworn revenge against a dead man's family? The apartment felt different when she returned to it, less like a sanctuary and more like a very comfortable cell. She had 12 hours to convince herself that accepting Alexander's offer was a choice rather than a surrender, but she already knew how the internal debate would end. Some prisons were lined with silk, and some captors offered protection instead of chains. But, in the end, the difference between salvation and enslavement often came down to which side of the bars you were standing on, and whether you had been the one to lock the door. He was making a terrible mistake. But when she thought about the alternative, returning to her apartment, going back to Murphy's diner, living in constant fear of when Tommy would make his next move, the risk seemed worth taking. The apartment building Alexander owned was everything he had promised: secure, comfortable, and completely anonymous. The unit Marcus showed her to was furnished in the same understated elegance as Alexander's office, with everything she could need for an extended stay. Mr. Hayes thought you might need these, Marcus said, handing her a small bag that contained basic toiletries and a change of clothes in exactly her size. The thoughtfulness of the gesture was both touching and slightly unnerving. How had Alexander known her size? How long had he been planning for this possibility? As Marcus left her alone in the apartment, Sarah found herself standing at the window, looking out at a view of the city she had never seen before. From this height, this distance, her old life seemed small and insignificant, a collection of problems that could be solved with enough money and influence. But money and influence always came with strings attached. The question was whether those strings would bind her to something better than what she was leaving behind, or whether she was simply trading one form of captivity for another. "Don't worry about them," he said calmly, making a series of turns that seemed random but gradually led them into increasingly busy traffic. "They'll lose interest once they realize they can't follow us where we're going." "Where are we going?" Sarah asked. Marcus smiled, but it wasn't entirely reassuring. "Somewhere safe. Mr. Hayes will explain everything when we arrive." As the silver BMW navigated through the city streets with the black sedan falling further and further behind, Sarah found herself entering a world she had never imagined existed. A world where power operated by different rules, where protection came with prices that weren't always measured in money, and where her life as a simple waitress was about to become far more complicated than she could have ever anticipated. Alexander Hayes stood smoothly, leaving the money on the counter. "Keep the change," he told her, though they both knew there had been no purchase to make change for. "And remember what I said about calling." As he walked toward the door, Sarah found her voice again. "Wait, why did you help me? You don't even know me." He paused with his hand on the door handle, looking back at her over his shoulder. "Let's just say I have experience with bullies, Sarah, and I don't like them very much." Then he was gone, disappearing into the storm as suddenly as he had appeared, leaving Sarah alone with Murphy's confused grumbling and more questions than answers. She looked down at the business card again, at the elegant lettering that seemed to promise things she didn't dare hope for. Outside, the rain continued to fall, washing the streets clean, while inside Murphy's diner, nothing would ever be quite the same again.